Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about the different requirements for facilities and equipment that directly impact food safety in your location. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the requirements for the building itself. And these are kind of strange, but the first thing is that all of your floors, walls, and ceilings have particular requirements that make sure that they're easy to be cleaned. So the first thing is that they need to be durable and easy to clean. So what this means is that in general you want them to not be porous, meaning that it has holes in it. You want it to be smooth so that it's easy to wipe off and easy to clean multiple times. So in general this means that your floors are going to be tile, and even if your walls are something like cinder block, they need to be painted with a type of paint that allows them to be scrubbed easily and cleaned easily. You don't want to have any bare cinder block, and everything needs to be sealed so that you don't have any pests able to get in. There are certain lighting requirements as well, and what this means is that you have different requirements for different areas. We're not going to get into what the specific amount of lumens, and lumens is what you measure light in, is required for different types of areas, but there's a few things that you might want to know about specifics. So the first thing is that any of your prep areas, you want them to be brighter than storage, or at least the requirement is that they be brighter than storage, because you want to make sure you can see if things are clean and see if things are the way that they should be to keep your food safe. Light bulbs, as you know, are glass and can shatter, and any glass that gets into food becomes a physical contaminant. So any bulbs that you have to have shields over top of them, and some of them are glass like this one, and some of them end up looking like little cages, but it's important to make sure that these are covered so that you don't have people getting glass shards in their food. Most people are never going to have the opportunity to build a restaurant from scratch, but if you are, you would check and make sure that all of your watts were correct for the different areas. But if you are replacing bulbs in a food service establishment, you always want to replace them with the same wattage or power in those bulbs, so that you make sure that you're not having lighting levels that are lower than they're supposed to be for certain areas. Ventilation in food service is super important. And the reason for this is that it removes heat and water vapor from the air. Ventilation is required, or ventilation hoods are required over any of your equipment that produces heat. So things like fryers or stoves or steamers, any of those items, because it's able to take anything that comes off of that straight out and is vented outside the building. If they're not maintained, over time grease is going to build up on those, and this has caused a lot of issues for a lot of places. What ends up happening is that as the grease builds up, if any sort of sparks fly up into the ventilation system, it can actually catch the building on fire, which is super dangerous. So it's very important that you maintain and clean these regularly. So you should have a schedule, and this should be worked into your cleaning schedule, of how often that you clean them as your employees at your location, but you also need to have a professional come in and look at it occasionally to make sure that nothing is clogged up and that everything is in good working order. If you don't have proper ventilation in your establishment, the kitchen gets unbearably hot, and eventually you can have a much higher risk of fire. Ventilation hoods look like this. They're over all heat-producing equipment, and your goal is to have them look as close to this as possible. But a lot of restaurants have ones that build up with a whole lot of extra grease and stuff, and this is what causes issues. If you'll notice, this also has the light bulb covers underneath it. Having lights under your vents is super important. There are also some overall maintenance requirements that get overlooked by a lot of locations. The first one is to clean every surface, including the walls, the ceilings, and the floor, to make sure that they are safe and that you don't have any contamination risk. You want to check all of your equipment often, some of it even daily, to make sure that temperature requirements are being met and that everything is in good working order. You want to make sure that there's no bugs or rodents in the location, because if you see one, chances are there's a lot more of them in your location. You also want to make sure that the outside is clean and maintained. This ensures that you don't have a buildup of bugs and rodents outside of your location that have the desire to get inside. So making sure that any grass is mown, any landscaping areas are well maintained, and that your parking lot is clean is super helpful for making sure that you don't have any issues with pests. Food service equipment goes through a lot of abuse in the course of a day, so any equipment that you have has to have the NSF Seal. This means that it's approved for food service use. That basically equates to it being durable, super easy to clean, and won't corrode. Things that have the seal are pretty much designed to hold up to washing and using all day long and taking a lot of abuse. So it's important that all of your items have that, and your sanitation inspectors are going to be looking for this seal on any equipment or dishes or anything that you use in the food service industry. This also means that you don't want to buy things that don't have this seal at places like Walmart or Target. And the reason for that is the things that you use in your home you might use a couple times a week, but anything you use in food service is going to be used constantly and consistently. This also means if you're looking for things for your home, getting things that are food service grade means that they're going to last a lot longer and they're a lot higher quality, and generally they're going to be cheaper than things that you buy for your home because they're not necessarily designed to be pretty, they're designed to be useful. Food service appliances and equipment are much less plug and play than household equipment. That's why it's important that you follow all manufacturers' instructions. Sometimes you'll even need a professional to come in and install it because you're going to be working with things like gas lines, water lines, or power and water together. The first thing you want to do with any of the equipment that you purchase is to check with your local authorities and make sure that that equipment is approved for use in your area. Different local laws can change a lot about the ways that a restaurant operates, so making sure that it's allowed in your area is going to save you a lot of grief later on when it comes to things like inspections. Any floor-mounted equipment, such as ranges or hot holding equipment, has to be mounted at least 6 inches above the floor. And there's a couple of reasons for this, the first of which is that it keeps critters from getting underneath it. Tabletop equipment has to be 4 inches off of the surface. Both of these distances between floor-mounted and tabletop equipment allow for easier cleaning underneath. If you can't clean underneath stuff, then a lot of things can build up over time, and that can cause a lot of risk and a lot of bacterial growth. Food service dishwashers are a lot different than home dishwashers as well. Part of the reason for that is you're not going to be washing things in a food service dishwasher that have been sitting around for 3 or 4 days. But with a food service dishwasher, you're going to be washing things that other customers will be eating later, so sanitation becomes increasingly important. Food service dishwashers take about 30 seconds to a minute to run. Some of them are conveyor belt types where the dishes go through and come out the other end clean, and some of them are the type where you lower a cage down over top of it, it cleans for a short period of time, and it rolls out the other side. With these types of dishwashers, because it's a lot less time, they need to be operating fully correctly to make sure that they are getting washed, rinsed, and sanitized in that length of time. When it comes to sanitizing in a dishwasher, there's 2 types. The first type is with hot water, and that hot water has to be 180 degrees or higher. The ways that you measure this are with a maximum registering thermometer or with maximum registering tape that registers the highest temperature that dishwasher gets to in the length of time that the dishes are going through. A maximum registering thermometer you can just lay in the tray and send it through. Maximum registering tape you just stick onto a dish that's going through and it turns a certain color when it gets up to the correct temperature. These operate a lot like the thermometers that you took your temperature with when you were a kid. You stick it under your tongue and it registers the highest temperature. So it's not a type of thermometer that we're not familiar with, it's just one that we don't think about in that way. Commercial dishwashers always need a professional to install them, and this is to make sure that all regulations are followed and that your water pressure and those types of things are correct. You want to place them in an area that minimizes contamination risk, and this is making sure that any new food that's going out of the kitchen is not going to be contaminated by any of the dirty dishes that are coming back in. So generally you use a separate door to come out with new food or to come back in with dirty dishes. You also want to make sure that you're only using detergents and sanitizers that are allowed to be used in your area. So that's going to be checking with your local health department, and that way you'll know which ones are allowed to be used. You want to clean them regularly, and usually this means either once a day or sometimes even once a service, like after lunch and after dinner. There's a lot of food that builds up in little trays in the bottom, and those need to be emptied or the water doesn't drain properly. This can interfere with the proper working of your dishwasher. So all dishwashers have certain things that they have to be able to measure, and this is usually done with gauges that are on the outside of the machines, and those gauges should indicate what the proper levels are for that particular machine. So the first thing is water temperature, and while the gauge will tell you what that is, and it's a good way to do a quick check, you also want to check occasionally with a maximum registering thermometer. And those look kind of like this, and those can go into a tray as it's going through the dishwasher, and you want to make sure that your water temperature is 180 or above to make sure that your dishes are getting sanitized. You can also use a maximum registering tape that works in the same way, it just turns certain colors and you stick it onto a glass or something like that. The next thing it has to be able to measure is water pressure, and this is super important because water pressure is kind of what gets stuff off of the dishes. So if the water pressure is not strong enough, then it's not going to wash off the dishes properly. You also need to be able to measure the concentrations of your cleaning chemicals and your sanitizing chemicals. If these are not at the correct concentrations, things won't be cleaned properly, but most importantly, if you're using chemical concentration, if the concentration is not correct, it can either be too weak and not kill bacteria, or if it's too strong, too much of the chemical may remain behind and it could make customers sick through chemical contamination. Most food service locations are going to have a 3-compartment sink. They look like this, and they have one section for washing, one for rinsing, and one for sanitizing. There are some locations that have 2-compartment sinks, and then you would wash in one sink and rinse and sanitize in the other. And there's requirements for temperatures and concentrations and all those types of things, but we'll go over those more in detail in the next video, part 10. But there's a few things that you need to know about these. These are used to wash dishes by hand, so manual hand washing. And if you ever had the opportunity to choose one for your location, you want to choose one that accommodates your largest equipment. And this is going to mean that you have enough room to wash every single dish that you have the opportunity to. You want to make sure that these stay clean and sanitized and that you're not leaving stuff in them overnight, because they can get very smelly very fast. Hand washing sinks in food service are extremely important because hand washing prevents so many different things like viruses. There's a few requirements for these and where they need to be in your location. The first of which is obvious. They have to be in or near a restroom so you can wash your hands after using the restroom. They need to be in prep areas because you might be handling things like raw meat. They need to be in service areas as well, due to people handling things like dirty dishes or having contact with customers. They also need to be in the dishwashing area for kind of the same reasons. People are handling things like dirty dishes that customers have eaten off of, or they might be handling things that have held raw food or things that could be contaminated. It's really important that hand washing sinks are never blocked so that you don't have things stored around them that can keep you from getting to them, or that they can never be used for other purposes. So they shouldn't be used for dishwashing or something to just stack stuff up on. If an inspector comes and sees those things, you're definitely going to have points stocked, and sometimes it could be an even bigger issue. Not only do hand washing stations have requirements for where they need to be, there's requirements for what's required at the hand washing stations themselves. And no matter how many hand washing stations you have in your location, every single one has to have these items. So the first thing is that you have to have hot and cold running water. If you remember back to the hand washing process, you have to have warm water in order to wash your hands properly. And every step is vitally important to make sure you're eliminating any germs. You also need to have soap, and liquid, foam, bar, or powdered is allowed. You're required to have a way to dry hands, so hand dryers and continuous towel systems are allowed, but in reality, the best way to remove any extra germs is by using paper towels. So if you have the choice, always use paper towels to dry your hands. You are required to have a trash can as well, and this is required regardless of the way that you offer to dry your hands. So some people think if you use a hand dryer or a continuous towel system that you don't have to have a trash can, but you always have to have a trash can available at hand washing stations. And finally, you have to have a sign, and you've all noticed when you go into restrooms in restaurants that it has a sign that says employees have to wash their hands, and every hand washing station has to have that, and every restroom has to have that. If you go back to the part 3 video and watch the hand washing video, you'll notice that all of these things are needed in order to properly wash your hands. So typically you'll see that inspectors focus on these very, very carefully, and a lot of the points that you see deducted will be for things like having ice in a hand washing sink or having bowls in there. So making sure that they're only used for their intended purpose is extremely important. Garbage is a big consideration within food service because it can cause a whole lot of issues. And the reasons for that are something that you'll see is pretty much common sense. The first of which is that it can draw critters. We've all noticed in the summer having lots of flies around garbage, but it can also draw things like mice and roaches and bugs, or even things like cats for outside dumpsters. So it's really important that you manage garbage well. So you want to make sure that you remove it often. Never leave it in your facility overnight. It can cause smells that are very hard to get rid of, and it just makes it that much more tempting for any sort of animals and stuff getting into it. You want to clean your cans often, inside and out, making sure that you get off any of the extra food residue and stuff, because that can draw animals as well. Making sure that they are visibly clean is super important to making sure that you don't have issues with pests. Any of your trash cans that you use inside have to be waterproof so they won't leak. They have to be durable so that they don't break down over time and bust open, and they need to be easy to clean so that you don't have things getting caught in dents and things like that are in the trash can. It's also really important that they have lids that are on them as long as they're not in use. They have to be kept away from any food or preparation areas, and obviously within reason you might have some nearby to throw things in, but you don't need to be doing things like peeling potatoes over a trash can and that kind of thing. Another super important thing about dealing with garbage is that dumpsters need to be closed and placed on a hard surface. You don't want stuff leaking out of the dumpster and then soaking into the grass, because that's going to cause issues over time. You also want to make sure that you keep them closed so that you don't draw any animals from around the area, like raccoons or cats or dogs or those types of things that could stir your trash all over the place. Requirements for utilities can vary based on the area that you're in, so it's important to communicate with your local regulatory authority to make sure that you're choosing things that fit in with the requirements that your area has. But you want to make sure that your plumbing is going to service the needs of the number of people that you're going to have in your facility. Make sure that you familiarize yourself with any lighting requirements, because there are specific requirements for different areas. And then perhaps the most important is that you need to have ventilation over any heat-producing equipment. And that needs to be installed correctly, and there's lots of regulations for how that works. So just make sure that you're in constant communication with your regulatory authority about what you're supposed to have for all of these areas. When it comes to water requirements, this can be the area that can have the most issues. If you don't have enough sewage capacity, then things can overflow pretty easily. Your sources of water can be public, obviously. It can be a well if it's tested and maintained regularly, or you can have portable water containers if they are able to be closed, or water transport vehicles. In general, most places are using public water sources, but the other areas are okay. Also, it's important that you only use a licensed plumber for any plumbing work that's done. They're used to working with areas that have the kind of capacity that food service locations do, and so they're going to make the best decisions to make sure that your water systems are working as well and for as long as possible. One of the most important ways that a plumber can help you is in helping you avoid cross connections. And cross connections in plumbing are considered to be a link between clean and dirty water. So what this means is that you have dirty water that has come out of the faucet into things like mop buckets or sinks, and then somehow the water will go back into the system. And so you always want to avoid creating cross connections. One way that this can happen is in filling a mop bucket. If you fill a mop bucket with a hose that's connected to a faucet, what can happen is that when you turn the water off, if the hose is still in the dirty water, it can suck the dirty water up the hose and back into the faucet. This means the next time that you run water, that water could come out of the faucet. It could also go into other areas of the kitchen and cross-contamination as well. You want to make sure that your water sources are kept as clean as possible. This also applies to any of your tanks and things that you're using if you're not using a public water source. Another issue that can happen with any plumbing system is backflow, and this is dirty water flowing back into clean water sources. But there is a device that can help with this, called a backflow preventer. And the way this works is, under normal circumstances, as the water is flowing through pipes, you're going to see it going in a regular direction. The backflow preventer is that little green flap that you see. Under normal circumstances, it stays down and water flows freely. As long as everything's in normal operations, it's good to go. But once it senses a change in pressure, as in there being a suction from the water source, which can happen when you turn water off, that flap comes up to prevent any dirty water from coming back into the system. So that flap is going to prevent any dirty water from contaminating the system as a whole. Backflow preventers are usually installed close to the street with any plumbing system, especially in food service. There's other systems that are smaller versions of this, however, that can go on individual faucets. These are called vacuum breakers, and if it feels any suction coming from the system, which can happen sometimes if you turn on water in another part of the kitchen. It will suck water up into the faucet. These systems keep that from happening in a smaller scale than the backflow preventer does. Another way to prevent water contamination is through an air gap. In the food service industry, no drains go directly into the floor. They're going to be cut off right below the sink and then drain into a floor drain. This means that if any sewage backs up, it's going to back up into the floor. So if you see by the bottom red arrow, there is a gap between the bottom of the pipe and the floor drain. This ensures that you don't have any sewage back up into your sinks. Another air gap that you'll see is between the bottom of the faucet and the top of the sink. That's seen by the top red arrow. And this means that if there's any dirty water in the sink and you turn on a sink in the other area, dirty water is not going to be sucked back up into the faucet to be put back out onto any dishes or food or anything that's in the sink. When it comes to pests, your first goal is to keep them out of your location to begin with. And this means looking for signs that they've been present and making sure that your building is tight without any cracks or holes that pests could gain access through. The next thing is you want to make sure that you don't give them food, water, or shelter. So for food, you want to dispose of all your garbage very quickly and clean any spills that you have as quickly as possible. In terms of water, you want to make sure that you don't have any standing water around your kitchen. And finally, for shelter, keep your garbage and recycling as far away from the building as possible. And with your storage, make sure that you're storing things with the FIFO rule, or first in, first out. This means that things won't be around for long enough for pests to gain access. You also want to make sure you only use licensed exterminators. If you don't use licensed exterminators, you could get in trouble if they spray the wrong thing and someone gets sick. And if you spot a couple, you probably have a ton of pests. So if you spot a couple, make sure you call your pest control operator and make sure that they are spraying as quickly as possible. It's inevitable that at some point you'll have an emergency that affects your location, and sometimes these emergencies can affect food safety. They can be things like fires, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, natural disasters, any number of things. Most of the time in these emergencies, you're going to lose power, and this can affect a lot of things within your business. First of all, loss of refrigeration. So that might mean that some of your TCS food is no longer safe. You also might lose security of your building, which means that you might not know who is coming and going in your building, and that can cause some issues as well. If you do lose security of your building, then looting might become a problem, and people might be getting food that's no longer safe to eat. So having a way to secure the building so that people don't take food that can make them sick is very important. One way to combat this is, if you lose security of your building or you lose power, giving away the food that you have before it becomes dangerous might give you some goodwill in the community, and it also means that you're not wasting food. Another problem you might have is with your water. Sometimes with flooding or hurricanes, water mains might break, or the water may no longer be safe to drink. As a food service location or as a food service manager, it is your responsibility to know whether your water is safe to drink. Generally, there are going to be advisories that come out, but in those cases, you have to make sure that you can operate safely before you reopen. If you have an emergency or a natural disaster, the first thing you want to determine is if there's a threat to food safety. And if there is, there's a few things you need to do. The first thing is you need to secure your building. Make sure that people can't gain access without you wanting them to. You want to clean up as much as you possibly can, make sure that things are sanitized and disinfected, and then establish temperature control. Make sure that you have access to refrigeration, and if not, you need to get the food out of your operation either by giving it away or moving it to another location where you're able to establish temperature control. Finally, make sure that your water is safe. You may be able to use it for cleaning, but sometimes it's not drinkable, so making sure that you communicate with the local health department is very important. If you have to close due to a natural disaster or an emergency that's a threat to food safety, you will need to be re-inspected before you open. So don't reopen without making sure that that's taken care of. Thank you for joining us on the summary of facilities and equipment as they relate to food safety. Join us for our final video, Food Safety Part 10, where we'll talk about cleaning and sanitizing. Thanks for joining us. Bye.